Chester Wager. Chester Wager was born on March 3, 1939 in Illinois. In March 1960, three women, Frances Murphy, Mildred Lindquist, and Lillian Oding, were found murdered at Starved Rock State Park. Wager, who was just 21 and a dishwasher at the park's lodge, was arrested and convicted of Lillian Oding's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Wager spent nearly 60 years incarcerated, maintaining his innocence throughout. After the 60 years of being in prison, he was granted parole in 2019 and released on February 21, 2020, at the age of 80. After his release, Wager has been involved in efforts to overturn his conviction. In January 2025, a mini-trial was set to begin on May 12th to present new evidence suggesting his wrongful conviction. John Phillips. John Phillips's life story is a life-touching example of the challenges faced by individuals with intellectual disabilities within the criminal justice system. Born in 1933, John Phillips grew up in Durham, North Carolina. At the age of 18 in 1952, he was arrested and charged with sexual assault. It was said that on a Friday afternoon in the spring of 1952, a 4-year-old girl was attacked near a playground. 3 days later, physicians examined the girl and told police there was evidence she had been sexually molested. Phillips was arrested the next day, according to the Durham Herald, which said he admitted to attacking the child in a thicket behind a recreational center, but that he got to thinking that it was wrong and desisted from the assault before completing it. At the time of his arrest, he was in the 9th grade, having the cognitive abilities of a 7-year-old, indicating a limited intellectual capacity. He was evaluated at the state mental hospital for Black individuals and subsequently pleaded guilty to the charges through his lawyer. Despite his intellectual limitations, he was sentenced to life in prison. Phillips spent 66 years incarcerated, making him North Carolina's longest-serving inmate. Throughout his imprisonment, he maintained his innocence. In 2018, at the age of 85, Phillips was released from prison. He was popularly known in prison as Peanut. He still maintained that he doesn't know why his lawyer entered a guilty plea. He said, "They just told me that I could live." Charles Edritt Ford. The sad and soul-wrenching part of this story is that Charles Edritt Ford was innocent. He was born in 1933, a man whose life was profoundly affected by a wrongful conviction. In 1952, at the age of 19, he was arrested and charged with the murder of a white woman in Charles County, Maryland. Despite his insistence on innocence and the lack of physical evidence linking him to the crime, Ford was convicted by an all-white jury and sentenced to life in prison. Ford spent 64 years incarcerated, making him the longest-serving prisoner in Maryland's history. Throughout his imprisonment, he maintained his innocence, saying that he had been wrongfully convicted. His case drew attention to issues of racial injustice. In 2016, at the age of 84, Ford was released from prison after a court ruling determined that his conviction violated due process. Following his release, he was placed in a nursing home due to health concerns. Clifford Hampton. Clifford Hampton was born in 1941. In 1958, at the age of 17, he committed a heinous crime in Ascension Parish, Louisiana. He attempted to pursue 18-year-old Bertha Ann Gibson romantically. After Bertha rejected his sexual advances, Hampton became extremely violent and brutally stabbed her 28 times, leading to her untimely death. Convicted of her murder, he received a life sentence and was incarcerated at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, also known as Angola. Despite already serving a life sentence, Hampton's violent behavior did not stop. At the age of 20, he killed a fellow inmate, Kami Time, allegedly because Time was telling lies about him. This led to a second life sentence, reinforcing his permanent incarceration at Angola. Prison records from Angola shows that Hampton's violent issues persisted over the years. He was convicted of a sex offense, found in possession of makeshift weapons, and refused to participate in mandated sex offender treatment programs. In 2017, Louisiana introduced a new law that allowed inmates who were juveniles at the time of their crimes to become eligible for parole. This law applied to Hampton, as he was 17 at the time of his first murder. Despite his violent history, Hampton was considered for release under this law. In 2018, his life sentence for the 1961 prison murder was vacated, and the charge was reduced to manslaughter, making him eligible for parole consideration. In 2019, after serving 61 years in prison, the Louisiana Board of Pardons and Parole granted Hampton parole. This decision was met with strong opposition from the family of Bertha Ann Gibson, who were devastated that their loved one's killer was being set free despite his history of violence. He was 89 years old when he got released from Angola. To this day, his whereabouts after release remain unknown. Lester Pearson. Lester Pearson, born in 1938, was a man whose life took a tragic turn in 1965. At the age of 27, Pearson was involved in a fatal shooting in New Orleans' Gentilly neighborhood. Pearson and the victim, a 19-year-old discharged soldier, had met earlier that day in the French Quarter. They shared drinks and got into a car together. However, a disagreement escalated between them, resulting in Pearson shooting and killing the soldier. Facing the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to the murder and was sentenced to life in prison. This sentence was handed down at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. He was 27 years old at the time of his crime and conviction. During his incarceration, he accumulated 19 infractions, primarily for contraband possession and disobedience, with the last recorded in 1996 when he was 59. As he aged, he became quieter and more reserved, reflecting on his past actions. When Pearson was initially sentenced, Louisiana's laws indicated that those convicted of murder would be eligible for parole after serving 10 years and 6 months. However, in 1979, Louisiana passed legislation eliminating parole for life sentences. After serving 57 years, Pearson was finally granted parole and released in October 2021 at the age of 84. His release was facilitated by the Louisiana Parole Project and endorsed by Orleans Parish District Attorney Jason Williams. Howard Christensen, born in 1920, Howard Christensen was 17 years old in 1937 when he and another 17-year-old hitchhiker, Norman Westberg, were arrested for the murder of 28-year-old schoolteacher Ada Carey in South Dakota. The crime involved both shooting and bludgeoning Carey during a robbery, making it one of the most notorious murders in South Dakota's history. Both Christensen and Westberg pleaded not guilty, but the jury found them guilty of murder committed during the commission of a felony. At that time, a life sentence was mandatory for such a conviction in South Dakota. The severity of the crime and the public outcry it generated led to the reinstatement of capital punishment in the state. Christensen was sentenced to life in prison and spent the majority of his sentence at the South Dakota State Penitentiary. Over the years, he also spent time in hospital psychiatric wards due to mental health concerns. His prolonged incarceration, totaling 64 years, made him one of the nation's longest-serving inmates. During his time in prison, he developed a reputation for being irritation and difficult behaviors, attributed to his extended confinement and mental health issues. In the mid-1970s, Christensen's life sentence was commuted to 200 years, making him eligible for parole. By 1995, at the age of 75 and after 58 years of incarceration, prison officials sought to transfer Christensen to a nursing home due to his advanced age and deteriorating health. He was eventually paroled in 2001 after serving 64 years in prison. Howard Christensen passed away in 2003 at the age of 82. Richard Honeck was born on January 5, 1879, and on September 30, 1899 in Chicago, Illinois. Honeck and his accomplice, Herman Hundhausen, both 20 years old at the time, fatally stabbed 20-year-old Walter F. Kohler in his room at Fulton Street. The motive behind this act was robbery. Following the crime, both Honeck and Herman were apprehended at Grand Crossing by Officer Thomas M. Whalen of the 13th Precinct. They were subsequently held by the coroner's jury. In November 1899, the judicial proceedings culminated in significant sentences for both individuals. Herman received a 20-year sentence in Joliet Penitentiary, while Honeck was sentenced to life imprisonment by Judge Baker. His time in prison was notably lengthy. He was incarcerated in the Southern Illinois Penitentiary in Chester, Illinois. Throughout his imprisonment, records indicate that he received only one letter and had a single visitor, showing the isolation he experienced during his decades behind bars. After serving 64 years and 1 month of his life sentence, a total of 23,418 days, Honeck was paroled on December 20, 1963. At the time of his release, he was 84 years old. After his parole, Honeck lived for approximately 13 more years and passed away on December 28, 1976, just shy of his 98th birthday. Joseph Ligon. Joseph Ligon was born on May 3, 1938, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was the second of 4 children. His mother worked as a nurse, and his father was an auto mechanic. He spent his early years on a farm in Birmingham, Alabama, under the care of his maternal grandparents. At the age of 13, Ligon relocated to South Philadelphia to reunite with his immediate family. Struggling academically, he was placed in special education classes and eventually dropped out of school, remaining illiterate into his teenage years. On February 20, 1953, a 15-year-old Ligon and several other teenagers, under the influence of alcohol, embarked on a spree in South Philadelphia that resulted in the stabbing deaths of Charles Pitts and Jackson Ham, with 6 others injured. Ligon admitted to stabbing one individual who survived, but consistently denied involvement in the fatality. Despite this, he was charged and was convicted of first-degree murder. Following a one-day trial, Ligon was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. a mandatory sentence in Pennsylvania for first-degree murder at that time, even for juveniles. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional. This decision was made active in 2016, prompting resentencing hearings for individuals like Ligon. In 2017, he was offered parole, but Ligon declined, saying that parole did not equate to true freedom. He continued his legal battle, and in 2021, a federal court ordered his release without parole conditions. On February 11, 2021, at the age of 83, Joseph Ligon was released after 68 years of incarceration. Paul Geidel, Jr. Born on April 21, 1894 in Hartford, Connecticut, Paul Geidel, Jr. faced significant challenges from a young age. His father, an alcoholic saloon keeper, died when Paul was just 5 years old, leading to much of his childhood being spent in an orphanage. He dropped out of school at 14 and worked various menial jobs in Hartford and New York City hotels. On July 26, 1911, at the age of 17, Geidel committed a crime that would define his life. He entered the room of 73-year-old William H. Jackson, a wealthy broker staying at the Iroquois Hotel in New York City, where he worked as a bellhop. He suffocated Jackson with a chloroform-soaked rag during a robbery, making off with only a few dollars. He was arrested 2 days later. Geidel was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. He began his sentence at Sing Sing Prison. In 1926, as he neared parole eligibility, doctors declared him legally insane, leading to his transfer to Dannemora State Hospital for the criminally insane, where he remained until 1972. He was then moved to Fishkill Correctional Facility. In August 1974, after 63 years of incarceration, he was granted parole. However, having spent his entire adult life behind bars and lacking family support, he chose to remain in prison, feeling unprepared for the outside world. He eventually accepted parole and was released on May 7, 1980, after serving 68 years and 296 days, the longest prison sentence in U.S. history at that time. Upon his release, he reportedly stated, "No publicity, please," to awaiting reporters. He passed away on May 1, 1987, at the age of 93. James R. Moore. James R. Moore was born on December 7, 1934, in New York. In 1962, at the age of 28, he was convicted of the sexual assault and murder of 14-year-old Pamela Moss in Penfield, New York. In that year, he was working as a gardener in the neighborhood of the Moss family in Penfield when he saw 14-year-old Pamela Moss on her way to an after-school babysitting job. He said he hadn't planned the attack, but when he saw Pamela, he approached her as she took a shortcut through the woods. He said he talked to her of the beauty of the woods, then grabbed her around the waist and suffocated her. After she was dead, he sexually harassed her and dumped her body in a water-filled gravel pit off Old Penfield Road. After he was arrested, he pleaded guilty to the charges, resulting in a life sentence. During his confession for Moss's murder, he allegedly told police he had molested at least 17 other girls. In 2022, after 60 years in custody, Moore was granted parole following 21 unsuccessful attempts. However, due to his advanced age and medical conditions, including hip fractures, kidney disease, and the partial amputation of both legs, he was unable to find suitable housing and medical care outside of prison. Consequently, he remained in the prison medical unit. He passed away on April 30, 2024, at the age of 90, in the medical unit of the Coxsackie Correctional Facility in New York. Johnson Van Dyke. Johnson Van Dyke was born on February 20, 1886, in Shelby County, Kentucky, near the town of Simpsonville. He was the son of freed slaves and moved with his family to Kokomo, Indiana, in 1900. In 1907, at the age of 21, Grigsby was involved in a fatal altercation during a poker game in Anderson, Illinois. The dispute escalated when racial slurs were exchanged, leading to a physical confrontation. During the fight, Brown pulled a knife on Van, then Van left the bar to retrieve a knife of his own. When Van returned, Brown picked up a chair and threw it at him. In response, Van lunged at Brown with his knife and then stabbed Brown to death. Grigsby pleaded guilty to second-degree murder to avoid the death penalty. Grigsby was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of James Brown. He served 66 years and 123 days at the Indiana State Prison from 1908 to 1974. After serving over 60 years, he was granted parole in 1974 at the age of 88. Following his release, Grigsby lived in various locations, including Chicago and Indianapolis. He passed away on December 28, 1987, at the age of 101. Francis Clifford Smith. Francis Clifford Smith was born on September 1, 1924. In July 1949, at the age of 24, he was involved in a robbery at the Indian Harbor Yacht Club in Greenwich, Connecticut. During the robbery, night watchman Grover Hart was fatally shot. Smith was arrested and charged with murder. In 1950, Smith was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. However, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment in 1954, just 2 hours before his scheduled execution. Smith served 70 years and 31 days in prison, making him the longest-serving prisoner in Connecticut's history. Over the years, significant revelations have shown that Smith could have been wrongly convicted. The lead investigator in the case acknowledged errors in the original investigation also. Another individual came forward, confessing to the murder and implicating Smith as an innocent man. In September 2020, at the age of 97, Smith was released on parole after serving 70 years in prison. His release was influenced by his advanced age and deteriorating health. Thank you for watching. Do you think these guilty individuals should be released from prison after serving long years? Comment below.